My name is Elle. I'm the cross-stitch artist and designer behind Chaos Kittens and Crafting, and welcome back to my cross-stitch tutorial series. In our last video, I talked all about the different materials that you'll need for cross-stitching, so hopefully you went out and got the stuff you needed, because today we are going to be getting started. Our first step today is going to be prepping our fabric to get it all ready to start stitching on, and that way we know where we're going to start stitching on our fabric. And then we're actually going to get into stitching today. So we are going to be doing the first block, maybe two, we'll see how far we get today, but we'll be doing at least the first block of our sampler pattern. If you have not seen the sampler pattern yet, this is what it's going to look like when it is all done. So we are going to be starting in the middle with this green square right here. Now, as I said, the colors that you choose to use for this sampler pattern are not super important. So if you don't have these exact colors, that is totally fine. Use what you have. Especially for today, color doesn't matter. I'm just letting you know when you're looking on here, when you're looking on your pattern, we are going to be starting with this center green block. With that said, we're going to switch over to our other camera view and get started. Here are all of the supplies we're going to be using today. So we're going to start with our pattern, of course. We have printed this off. If you need a link to this pattern, again, there is a link to it in the description down below. This is a free sampler pattern that I designed specifically to go along with this tutorial series. You're going to need your fabric. It's going to be cut in a 7-inch square if you are using 14 count fabric like we talked about in the last video. I am going to be using a hoop for this because I do find it easier. It will also allow me to stitch without having to hold the fabric or the hoop in my hands as I'm doing this tutorial for you guys, because I will be able to put it in my craft stand. That is not necessary for you guys, but I will be using this. Today we're going to be stitching with a green color. It could be any color. Like I said, this is just the color that it calls for in the pattern, so this is what I'm going to be stitching with, as well as a needle. I have it here on my needle minder just so I don't lose it. Scissors, a pencil, and then this is what our finished product is going to look like. Obviously, you don't have yours yet. This is what we are working towards. So let's get started. The first step of our process is going to be preparing our fabric for stitching on, which means we need to find the center of our fabric. Now we could just guess and start with where we think the center is, but there is actually a way to do this that's pretty easy. And what I like to do is I take my fabric and I fold it in half. I take a pencil, mechanical pencil, regular pencil, doesn't really matter, and I do a very light line across the middle of the fabric. Now, when I say a line, I mean where the holes are. So this line should line up with a row of holes going above and below it. I'm not sure if you can see that, but we want to make sure our line is on the holes and not in between the holes, because if you remember, we are going to be stitching through those holes, so that's where we need the center of our fabric to be. Then I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees, and I'm going to do the exact same thing again. That way, I will now have an X, or a little cross, that shows me where the very center stitch of my fabric is on this piece. Now, because I have drawn on this in pencil, this is going to be the back of my piece of fabric. I will actually have my finished product stitched here on the front. If you fold your piece in half and you find that the center line is in between two holes, just rotate it a little bit back or forward one direction or whatever, whichever feels most comfortable to you, and draw the line there. You just want to make sure that those lines are drawn in a row with the holes and not on the fabric in between. Our next step, now that we know where the center of our fabric is going to be putting our fabric into a hoop. If you have decided that you're not going to be using a hoop, that's totally fine. Just skip this part. Our hoops look like this. It has a screw up at the top and 2 rings. The center ring should be solid, and the outside ring is expandable because of this screw. So we are going to unscrew this almost all the way. So like that. I still want it to be caught through there, and I'm gonna pop that center ring out. Now, I did say this was going to be the back side of my fabric, so I am going to flip it over. and center it as best I can on this circle. So the way I do that is I flip it, I kind of eyeball it to try and make sure that that center is as close to center as I can eyeball it. We are gonna be, you know, going back and adjusting it again at the end. So if you don't get it perfect, that's okay. But as centered as I can. And then I'm going to be pressing this outer ring down on around it and sandwiching the fabric between the two rings. Now this can take a little bit of muscle power. This is much easier to do if you are doing this on a hard surface like a tile floor or a countertop or a table. I'm doing this on a lap desk, so I may struggle just a little bit because it's got, you know, the soft and squishy and it's on my legs, so it's not a solid surface. So if I make this look a little bit more difficult, I apologize. But yeah, use a solid surface. It'll be much easier for you. So you want to expand this ring as far out as it'll go, and that will help you get it down over the fabric. The other thing that I try to do personally is I try to line the screws up with the direction of the holes so that it's on a grid. I don't want my screw to be off center. But that's just me. Again, we will be adjusting this again at the end. So if it is a little bit off or a lot off, that's totally fine for right now. So we are really going to be pressing this down. Now, if I let this go, it is going to kind of try and jump back off of there. And how I can fix that is holding it down still, just tighten it a little bit at a time. Tighten it down. And then when it feels like it's snug enough for you to at least let it go, I'm actually going to press it down further. So press it, hold it, tighten just a little more. Press it down a little bit more, tighten it just a little bit more. And I just kind of go back and forth between tightening it down and pushing those hoops on so that they are nice and even. I want those hoops to be sandwiched just like they were before, as close as I can get them to being even. You can flip it over and work it from the back if that's a little bit easier to push this back hoop forward. You can also go around and pull on the fabric all the way around, as long as you are tugging evenly, going all the way around, working in a circle. This is especially helpful if you're using larger hoops. These smaller hoops, you don't need to pull the fabric as much. But if you're working in larger hoops like 8, 9, 10-inch hoops, you're probably going to have to stretch that fabric. The goal is to get this fabric tight as a drum. So you want it to be real nice and tight, so it kind of makes that noise when you tap on it. You don't want there to be a lot of give in this fabric. Because as we're working on it, the fabric can stretch and it can sort of like bow out a little bit. The looser the fabric is in here, the harder it's going to be to stitch with. But that is what we are looking for. So nice and tight. I just do this until it's finger tight, so I can't really tighten that down anymore unless I got out like a pair of pliers, and I don't want to do that. This is plenty tight, okay? The next thing I personally am going to do is I'm actually going to put this into my craft stand. If you don't have one of those, don't worry about it. It is something that I did not have until I had been stitching for about 20 years. It was definitely a game changer for me personally, but it is not something that you have to go and spend your money on right away. It is a tool that I use especially when I am doing instructions and teaching, because it will hold onto my hoop, my project for me, so that I can use both hands to talk and describe stuff without having to keep setting it down and waiting for my camera to refocus and things like that. So I'm gonna pop this into my craft stand real quick and I'll be right back. All right, so my hoop is in the craft stand right now, but we're gonna take a pause and we're actually going to look at our pattern for a moment and talk about how to read it and what we're looking at here. So this is a printout of the sampler pattern we are going to be working on. And like I said, we are gonna be starting in this center block right here. So how do we read this? Our pattern is written on a grid, and this grid is a direct correlation to the fabric itself. Everywhere we have two lines of our grid coming together, that's where the holes of our fabric are going to be. So this is where we're going to be stitching through to make the little X shapes from one corner to another, and then from one corner to another to make that X shape. So anywhere you see a symbol, that's where we're going to be making our crosses on our fabric. So how do we know where to start? Well, like we just prepped our fabric, we found where the center of our fabric is. Now let's find where the center of our pattern is so that we can match those two things up and get started in the correct place. So there are two different ways that a pattern might show you where its center is. My patterns actually show you both, which is kind of cool. So one of the ways it's going to show you is with a triangle on the top and left-hand side of your pattern. This is showing that this center of this pattern is actually an entire row and not a line like we drew on the back of our fabric. So be aware that some patterns that only have triangles might not show you the line, it might be showing you the row of stitches. So just be aware of that. And on the left, it's the same. Occasionally you'll see patterns where these triangles are on all four sides. Mine only have them on the two, but that's fine. The other thing that a lot of patterns will do is there will be one line that is a different color, usually red, and that is going to indicate where the center line of each pattern is. So even though the actual true center is a row on my pattern, you can see with this red line that they have bisecting down and across, that they're showing that the very center of my pattern should be here. Okay, so we are going to match up this center dot with the center dot on our hoop when we start stitching. Now, as you notice, this center dot is not touching any symbols. So there is not going to be any thread pulled through this center dot on our actual cross stitch piece. That's okay. We're still using it as a starting point. We're using it so that we know where to go and where to start our piece from. So now that we know that, let's get our floss prepped, and then we'll get back over to our actual hoop and figure out where our needle is going to come up first, okay? Here's the color that I'm gonna be starting with. It's DMC brand and the color is 905. It's this pretty green color. So I'm gonna start by rolling some of it off of the bobbin. You don't want too much thread and you don't want too little because you don't want to be tying off all the time, and you also don't want to have a whole bunch of excess that's going to tangle and knot as you're going. I like to cut 18-inch strands or 18-inch pieces. That is a really good amount. You can get a decent amount of stitching, but it's not too long that it's going to create a lot of tangles and knots for you. So I actually have a special floss winder that measures it out for me, so I'm going to use that. If you don't have that, that's okay. Eyeball it or use a ruler until you get a handle for how long you want your pieces of floss to be. I used to stitch with pieces that were much longer than this. There's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want to do. But nowadays I just keep everything pretty uniform. It just makes things a little bit easier for me. It also helps me because I like to know how many stitches I get per amount of floss. So I know that with an 18-inch piece like this, I get a little over 100 stitches per. So it's a good way for me to be able to eyeball, do I have enough floss for this? Do I need more? Things like that. So we're actually going to look at the end of this for a moment. And as you can see, floss, embroidery floss, is split into 6 separate strands that they've sort of twisted together. So you can see all 6 of them there. We are not going to be stitching with all 6 of them. At least not today. We will at some point because that is part of the sampler pattern, but for today, we're just gonna be stitching with 2 strands. So what are we gonna do with the rest of these 4? We're gonna set them aside and save them for later. So what we're gonna do is we're going to pull 4 of them to one side and 2 of them to the other, and we're just gonna gently pull them apart like this. Now, if it gets to this point where you're pulling and it's not unraveling anymore, I like to grab it a little bit closer and just give this end a tug, and usually it will start unrolling again. But if it's becoming particularly finicky, having that third point of contact is really good to keep this unraveling nicely, but it's hard to do with just 2 hands. So I actually usually put this end just in my mouth. I just sort of put it between my lips and use that as a point to hold it. So you'll see me up in the top frame. I'm actually going to do that. and I'm able to just pull it apart really, really easily then. So again, I'm gonna set these 4 strands aside, and I'm just gonna hang on to these 2 strands for the moment. Inevitably, at some point, you will hear someone say, don't tie knots when you are cross-stitching. As a general rule of thumb, I understand why that rule exists or existed in the past especially. And that's because when we think about cross-stitch as a traditional art form, it was typically used on clothing for decoration, on tea towels, on things like that where you weren't going to be able to cover up the back, and we didn't want those knots to be touching someone's skin. We didn't want them to be visible on the back of a tea towel, things like that. So being able to stitch without having any knots or tangles or even purposeful knots on the back of your piece was considered like good form, and it was considered the best way to do it. However, when you are just getting started cross-stitching, we get to break the rules a little bit, because the point is to get you comfortable with the stitches themselves and worry about the technicalities of everything else later. The other thing that I will say is you can see all of these cross-stitch pieces behind me on the wall that I have made myself. I think all but one of them has knots on the back of it. And I guarantee you, looking at them, even if you were to come and look at them in person without taking them off the wall and flipping them over and looking at the actual stitches I used on the back, you would not be able to tell which ones have knots and which ones don't. And like I said, almost all of them have knots, except one that I know for sure that I did not tie any knots on because I was doing a different tutorial video. So I stitched that entire piece with no knots whatsoever. But I guarantee you, if you have not seen that video, you do not know which piece it is up there. With that said, we are going to start with a knot. And like I said, if you already know how to cross stitch and you're yelling at me in the comments, hold your horses. This sampler pattern teaches 5 different methods for starting floss and 3 different methods for ending it. Tying a knot at the beginning and the end is only one of those methods. I will teach other techniques. However, I truly believe that this is the easiest method to get started with for people who are just getting their feet wet. So that's what we're going to do. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tie a double knot in the end of our piece of floss here. This might be a little tricky when you're first getting started to figure out how to get that knot to sit right on top of the other one. Just keep trying. You're going to do great. You will get there. Okay, so there is our little double knot. The other end of our piece of floss, we are going to thread onto our needle. So as we're threading our needle, we are going to be pushing these 2 strands of floss through the eye of our needle. The best way to do that is going to be to lick the thread, get it wet, pinch it down really tight before we try to thread our needle. They do make different needle threading tools as well as like self-threading needles and things like that. So if that's something you're interested in, you can definitely look into that. I've never actually used them. So this is just how I do it. And I like to pinch the thread between my fingers and sort of slide the needle itself over the edge of the thread until I can grab it and pull it through. You're going to want to leave a little bit of a tail on that side so that as you're stitching, as you're pulling your needle through your fabric, you're going to be grabbing onto that tail so that it doesn't slip back through and off of your needle again. And just like that, we have our floss ready to go and we're ready to start stitching. All right, so we are going to start by putting our needle through the very center of our fabric. So we're actually going to flip our project over, find that center hole, just like we did before, and I'm just gonna poke it through a little bit. I'm not pushing the needle all the way through. I'm not pushing any of the thread through. I'm gonna flip my project back over so I can see the tip of my needle coming through the center of my project. That's how we know, remember, right where the center of our project is. Now, that's not actually where we're going to be starting, remember, because there are no stitches touching this hole. Instead, I'm going to be going over one hole and down one, so diagonally down to the left, so that I can start in this top left corner of my little box down here, okay? So I'm going to go over one and then down one, and that is where I'm going to pull up my first stitch, okay? I'm going to set this down for just a second. There is one thing that I have not covered so far, and that is what direction do you stitch? Because as you are laying down your stitches, obviously you're laying down one half of the X and then the other half of the X. It doesn't matter which direction you go first. You can do all of your X's going this direction first and then the other ones go on top, or you can go this direction first and the other ones go on top. The only recommended, not required, the recommendation is that all of your X's go the same direction across your entire piece. Like I said, this is not a hard and fast rule. There are plenty of people who stitch willy-nilly whatever direction they feel like stitching, and their pieces look just fine at the end of the day. I can say that the distinction is a very, very subtle. It's very hard to notice unless you are also a cross-stitch designer. If you are, or not a cross-stitch designer, unless you are also like a cross-stitcher. Unless you are into the craft, you will not notice if somebody's stitches are willy-nilly or if they are all laying the same direction. I'm going to teach you how to lay them all the same direction because I personally think it looks cleaner. But again, I'm a professional, so I know to look for those things. Like I said, if you want to stitch willy-nilly, that's totally fine. So we started in that top left corner. We are going to complete our first cross. So we are going to go from the top left down to the bottom right. So we're going to go diagonally down one and go back through, pull our thread all the way through. Now you can pull this thread pretty tight. I wouldn't like give it a good yank, but you do want to make sure that your thread is not loose and floppy on the top. Then we are going to come back up through one of our other two corners to finish that cross off. Again, it doesn't matter which direction you go, just finish that cross off. So this is our top left stitch done. Congratulations, you have done a cross stitch. Now we are going to fill out the rest of this box. I'm going to be moving across and then down and across and then down and across again and ending in this bottom right-hand corner. So this time on the back of my piece, I'm going to be going up diagonally because again, I want to lay all of these crosses down with this direction first. That is a personal preference for me. Like I said, yours may be different. The way that we're stitching right now, where we are finishing each X before moving on to the next one, is called the English method of stitching. There is another method called the Danish method where we do not finish our crosses before moving on. We lay down half of the crosses going in one direction and then finish off by going back the other direction. That's actually typically how I cross stitch, but again, we are working with what is the easiest thing to do to get you started, English method. So this may take you a little bit more time, especially because I am stitching two-handed, meaning one of my hands is behind my work the entire time and one of my hands is on top the entire time. Don't worry, you can pause this section while you get it figured out. Take your time. Take your time, there is no rush. Just make sure every time you're bringing your needle up that you are bringing it up through one of the holes and not in between. So like right now, that's in between a hole. That is not actually in the hole that it's supposed to be. I've caught it over one of the threads. So I'm gonna move that back where it's supposed to be. It's one of the best things you can do to make sure that your piece comes out looking really clean and finished when you're done is making sure that you are only going through the proper holes and not accidentally faking them. This is our last stitch and bring it back down. So that is our first little box right here, all done. That is going to be our center box of our sampler pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip my piece back over to the back, and now we're going to do one of our tying off methods. Again, this is going to be a knot. It's okay, I promise. I think we will have time on this video to talk about a different starting and ending method. So we're gonna do another another box as well. So let's start with our first tie off method. This is going to be tying a knot on the back of our piece. So as you can see up here, we have our little knot. We have a little tiny tail sticking off of it. We can cut that tail a little bit shorter if we want to. I usually don't bother, but in this case, I am gonna do it just so that visually you can see what I'm doing just that much easier by having a little less visual clutter, okay? So I do tie off in a very specific manner on the backs of my pieces because I want those knots to be very close to the back of my fabric. I don't want them to be sitting away like ½ an inch or an inch away from the back of the fabric, because then my stitches on the front can pull loose over time. So let me readjust this angle to pull it back so that I can get my hands in here to tie the knot and show you how I do that to make sure that knot is tied real tight against the back of the fabric. Okay, so we've changed our angle just a little bit. That way you can see better and I have a little bit more room for my hands without bumping into the camera. So I'm gonna take this thread in my left hand, and with my right hand, I'm going to pull it, flip it, and make a triangle shape. Okay, so I'm making a triangle shape with these crossed. I'm going to feed the tail through the center of my triangle by passing the 2 points over to my left hand and pulling the tail over to my right, okay? So I've passed the thread through. Now I'm going to shimmy this corner of the triangle as close down as I can by just kind of working it down. And then I'm gonna put my finger right on top there. And I'm gonna hold that thread down while I pull the tail nice and tight. Okay, and now I have one little knot right against the back of my fabric. Now I'm gonna do that again, because again, we want a double knot, that way nothing pulls through. Single knots can sometimes pull through the fabric because they're too small. Sometimes they will wiggle their way through these little tiny holes. So again, tail in my left hand, I'm gonna make a loop on the right, like that, so it makes a triangle shape. I'm gonna pass this tail through the center of my triangle by flipping hands. And again, I'm gonna shimmy this corner of my triangle, this time underneath my first knot. Getting it underneath that first knot is gonna be key to keeping this knot, to getting this knot to tie on top of itself and not just tying a second one right next to it, because that's not helpful. So once it is shimmied underneath, I'm once again gonna put my finger on it and gently pull that tail like that. So now I have a nice little double knot right against the edge of my fabric, and I'm going to snip this like that. And our first box is done. There we go, look at that, we did it. All right, let's get our next color and we will talk about another starting technique and another ending technique for you. This time I'm gonna be using blue 996. It's a very like electric blue color. So again, I'm going to be cutting off an 18-inch piece of this. Obviously we had some green left over. Remember, we had the 4 strands of it, but we also had plenty of that 2 strand that we were stitching with left over as well. Again, just set it aside. Put it back, wrap it back up on your bobbin, and save it for later, because we have some other green stitches that are going to be worked on here as well. So we will use that thread, and you can also save it for future projects as well. Again, the color for this doesn't matter. I've split 2 strands off. We're going to be working with 2 strands almost exclusively on this pattern, except when I tell you otherwise. There we go. That one came apart really easily. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to rewrap my bobbin. I'm gonna take, this is the 4 strands that I had. I'm also gonna wrap this on my bobbin so that I can use it later. And any extra of this that I have, I'm just gonna do the same thing when we're done. All right, for this starting and ending technique, there will be no knots whatsoever. So the first thing we're gonna do is we are just gonna thread our needle on one end. There we go. We have our tail just like we did before. And let's get our piece back over here. Now, what we can do to make sure we are keeping track over here is we can take a highlighter and we can highlight these squares that we just stitched. So I'm going to highlight these guys like that. That way we know that those ones are done. Look at that. That's how far we are on our pattern. Now, our blue is gonna go in this next box above it. So we're gonna have to do a little bit more counting now. If we wanna start in this top left corner of this box, we're gonna start by putting our needle up through here, and then we're gonna count up the holes on our piece. So starting at this corner, we're gonna go up 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, okay? So we are gonna start by getting our needle into that corner, and then we're gonna go up 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. This is why it is called counted cross stitch, and honestly, the trickiest part of cross stitch is just going to be making sure that you keep your counts correct. So this method is sometimes referred to as like weaving under or tucking the tail under or something along those lines. Basically, we're going to be trapping the tail of our floss under our stitches. So we're going to start by pulling this thread out, but on the back of our piece, we want to make sure we leave an inch or two of floss. So I'm going to use my finger to hold that down as we're doing our first few stitches, okay? But I don't want to poke myself, okay? So we pull up, we make sure that we have that little bit of floss on the bottom. I'm going to move my hand for the moment so that I don't poke myself. I push my needle down into the bottom right of that corner, just like we made our X before. This time I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to hold that tail down as I pull this piece. Make sure it's nice and tight. Make sure there's no loops or knots stuck on the front. I'm gonna pull it nice and tight. Now, I'm gonna go up and over this tail. I wanna make sure that the tail gets trapped under this stitch, okay? So again, I'm still holding that tail down, but I am pulling it nice and tight, okay? Now, we're gonna do the Danish method this time instead of the English method. So instead of coming back and finishing this X, I'm going to go across this whole little row, it's only 3 stitches, this whole row going this direction, this direction, this direction. And then we'll go back and we'll backtrack and do the rest of it, okay? Just trust me if you can't picture it. So, I'm moving my hand out of the way so I don't poke myself, but I'm going to push my needle down into the next stitch. This is going to be the bottom right of our second stitch, okay? Flip it over, hold this tail down so I make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Pull this nice and tight. If you need to double check and make sure you don't have any loops or knots on the front, go ahead and do that. And again, we're going up and over this tail to come back on our next stitch. Again, my finger is holding that tail down on the back right now. And we're gonna do that one more time. Move my hand away so I don't poke myself. Back down. Okay, so now we have half of our crosses across this top row. This is actually called the tenter continental stitch. We will be going over this later as a stitch in and of itself, but congratulations, you just did 3 tent stitches or 3 continental stitches, depending on how you term them. They're the same stitch. Okay, but now we're gonna go up one more time and we're gonna come back the other direction and finish off all of those crosses. So again, I wanna make sure that this tail is getting caught underneath all of these little stitches on the back here. So up and over, pull it through. Now at this point, your tail should be very secure. We just wanna make sure that the tail is running under 3 to 5 stitches. Usually 4 is a comfortable number for me, but if I can only get it under 3, that's totally fine because this pattern only has 3 across. 3 is all you're gonna get. That's totally fine. We can actually go again and snip this tail a little bit shorter if we want, or we can do it later on, but there you go. So that is starting your floss by weaving under or by tucking the tail under. Basically, you just wanna make sure that the tail of that floss is nice and trapped under like 3 to 4 stitches. And I can tug on this really hard and it's not going to go anywhere. All of those different angle changes that we did are holding that floss nice and tight to the fabric now. So again, now we're gonna go back the other direction and finish up our X's. So now we're gonna be going top right to bottom left, down to finish our third stitch, and then we're gonna finish our second stitch, and then we're gonna finish our first stitch. So that is the Danish method. It is worked like tent or continental stitches going one direction across a row and then finishing them off by coming back the other way. So we're going to continue the Danish method for the other 2 rows of this block. So we're gonna go diagonally down, because remember we want our first cross to be laid this direction. And then we're gonna go across, or go over and do the rest of our Danish stitches. Remember, you can pause here, take as long as you need to work these stitches. And then our third row, we're going to be doing the same thing where we work one direction and then finishing them the other direction. There is our last stitch. So how do we tie this one off? Remember I said no knots. We started by weaving the end under or tucking the tail under. We're actually going to end the same way. However, we can't trap it under stitches as we go. So this time we're going to flip our work over, and leaving our needle on here, I'm going to run my needle under these just on the back of my piece. Just make sure you don't grab any of your fabric when you do this, but I'm running it under those vertical stitches that we made on the back. If you have to run it in a vertical direction or a diagonal direction or some other direction in order to make sure you get it under 3 stitches or 4 or 5 stitches on the back, do whatever direction you need to do. It doesn't matter. It just works out because the way we stitch this, especially with the Danish method, that all those stitches are nice and vertical. It's real easy to run them under the edge there. And then just pull the needle so that those are trapped under there. And then you just snip. There you go. You have learned 2 different starting methods, 2 different ending methods, and you have also learned both the English method and the Danish method of stitching, all in our very first tutorial video. With just these skills, honestly, with just one starting and ending method, or just using the English method, or just using the Danish method, you can start cross-stitching. Like, congratulations, you did it. You can work on your first piece. If you don't like this sampler pattern, if you want to try something else, you don't need any of the other skills to do the vast majority of the cross-stitch patterns that are out there. Like I said, we are going to cover some other starting and ending methods. We're going to cover a lot of specialty stitches and stuff like that, because I think that those are good skills to sort of have in your toolbox. But if this is all you're looking for, congratulations, you're done. You did it. You can now cross stitch. You now know how to read a pattern. You know how to, count and get started with new colors. You know how to end a piece of floss. You have all of the skills needed to go forth and cross stitch. If you want to stick with me for the rest of the tutorial series, we are going to be covering, like I said, 3 additional starting methods, 1 more ending method. Over here on this row, we're going to talk about the number of strands of floss that you stitch with. Remember earlier I said for the most part, we're going to be stitching with 2 strands over this pattern. This column is going to be our exception, where we stitch with 1 strand, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then all 6 strands, which let me tell you is very difficult on 14 count fabric, but it's really cool and it gives you like a nice 3-dimensional texture. So if you ever want to add like some fun things like that to your piece, it might be something to consider. Over here, we're going to be talking about 3 different methods of color blending. We're going to be covering quarter stitches. We're going to go over those tent or continental stitches that you guys just mastered perfectly, but we are going to add them to our sampler pattern as a stitch in and of itself. We're going to be doing half stitches and 3/4 stitches. We're going to go over French knots. We're going to talk about how to add beads to your cross stitch pieces. I'm going to go over 3 different methods to add beads and how to secure them. And then we're going to finish up with back stitching, which is a very cool thing to add to patterns. So back stitching usually goes on top of colors that we've already laid down. And this is also called black work. So it can be called back stitching if it's laid on top of color. If it's just by itself, like it is on this border, and it's like repeating patterns, it's usually referred to as black work. But we will be going over how to do all of those things as well. So I hope you join me next time. We are going to be going over the other methods of starting and ending. So that's going to be it for today, is those 2 starting and ending methods. Next time we're going to cover 3 more starting methods and 1 more ending method to finish up our first column of our sampler pattern. Thank you so much for coming and hanging out with me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to my tutorial series. I hope that you have learned so much, and I hope you stick around to learn even more. If you would like to hang out and ask questions, I do live stream on TikTok and Twitch on Wednesdays and Sundays at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So feel free to come, hop in, ask questions, just hang out and craft with us. Usually I'm doing cross stitching. Sometimes I do other stuff as well, but for the most part it's cross stitching, and I'm always happy to answer any questions that you have. So be sure to come and hang out. If you'd like to check out any of the other patterns that I have designed, you can find the links to all of that kind of stuff down below. Once again, thank you so much for being here, and happy crafting.